Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday. This is Andrew Lawton, fellow with the True North Initiative, back for yet another Facebook Live, this time with a lot to talk about and a lot of different themes of the same story. And that story is unfortunately the tragic Toronto shooting that took place Sunday night. Police, we now know, have named Faisal Hussein as the shooter. The SIU specifically, Hussein, 29, killed two women, a girl and a woman, a 10-year-old girl and an 18-year-old woman, and injured 13 others. And it's so challenging for people in the media to respond to something that is so breaking and so urgent and to not have the facts. People fill in the blanks. And this is one of the biggest problems whenever a tragic event like this happens, is that if you read or listen to anything in the first 24 hours, you're probably going to be misinformed. And in some cases, this is just the normal run-of-the-mill, we're still trying to find our sea legs sort of response to this thing. And other people will take a wait-and-see approach. Cable news doesn't. I mean, one of the most spectacularly bad examples of this was the Boston bombing, the Boston Marathon bombing a few years back. You watch CNN, and I think they probably named like 37 different people as the suspect by the time we actually found out it was the Tsarnaev brothers. But apart from that normal response to something imminent, there is another dimension to it of how coverage gets skewed. And that is when agendas start to be at work here. Agendas to stop the truth or agendas to craft a new truth. And you've heard the expression in the past, I don't know who coined it, it might have been Glenn Beck or someone else, that truth has no agenda. We had this shooting happen Sunday night. By Monday morning, about 12 hours later, Mayor John Tory in Toronto had decided to make it about gun violence. That was what it was, gun violence. Not even 24 hours, 12 hours after the shooting. And it was about how, in his words, why does anyone in this city need to have a gun? We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then that gun narrative unfolded even further as of Tuesday night when City Council in Toronto passed a motion banning handguns. Well, they don't actually have the jurisdiction to ban handguns, so all they did was pass a motion saying that they want someone else to ban handguns. Again, I'll get into the gun component here, but then we have what is the most fascinating dilemma here, and that is the way that Faisal Hussein is being treated. He's dead, and I have no love lost over that. But the thing that's interesting here is that he's being given this glamour treatment by a lot of people in the press and a lot of people on the left. And it's not even just that he's been, it's not that the evil has been glossed over. It's that instead of saying this is a bad guy and the bad guy did something bad, we start trying to explain away the reasoning. And that's where the one tweet that I think it's up to like 1,500 retweets now, was a Toronto Star headline where it was talking about his complicated past filled with family misfortune. Now, if I were to not tell you anything else about the story, but I were to say, okay, today, folks, on the True North Initiative Facebook page, I'm going to talk about someone who had a complicated past and a family full of misfortune. You'd think that I was telling you a story about some comeback kid, a story of someone who overcame the odds to do something great. You wouldn't think I was talking about a potential terrorist, or at the very least a murderer. You just wouldn't, because those are the terms that we use to describe people that are troubled and disturbed and people that are actually conquering the odds. And that language is very important. And I don't believe for a second that the Toronto Star headline writers aren't aware of the power of that type of language. And you see this happening in so many ways where we can't just accept that there is a difference between good and evil. And by the way, that good and evil even exist. That in and of itself is a challenge in many respects. But when we look at the bad guys of our age now, the bad guys of our era, we have to try to find something other than the painfully obvious answer. And in this case, I have no idea if Faisal Hussein was in conversation with ISIS. ISIS has claimed responsibility through a release that was distributed through the propaganda agency Amaq. That is not irrelevant. Is it something that we can take as a singular piece of evidence and say, ergo, he was a terrorist? No. But this fits the profile. And oftentimes, there is a difference between the we don't know if it's terrorism, so we're going to wait and see, and there's no way this is terrorism, look somewhere else. And the problem is that we see an increasing number of examples of people falling in willingly to that second category of refusing, even when all evidence is pointing to terrorism, to accept that something was terrorism. And a great example of that was the Torontonian a few years back, or maybe 2 years back, that went in and stabbed people at the Soldier, stabbed people at the Soldier Recruitment Center. And he said, Allahu Akbar. He said, I'm doing this in the name of ISIS. And what did the Toronto Star say? He was disturbed. Well, yes, he was disturbed. But again, we are even telling terrorists that they're not terrorists now. That's how much there is a refusal and an unwillingness to accept that terrorism is actually a reality. Is that even when someone says, yes, I am a terrorist, yes, I'm doing this in the name of Allah, we say, oh, no, you're not. What was another example of that? The woman who took a knife out at Canadian Tire, I think it was in Scarborough, and then started beating employees with a golf club. She was in court. She was like begging the judge to let her be a terrorist. She was begging the judge, I'm a terrorist, I'm a terrorist, I'm doing this for ISIS, I'm doing this for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And then they're like, no, she's unwell. She may well be unwell. But here's the problem, is that when we look at the two silos of this discussion, or three, let's look at all three examples: mental illness, terrorism, gun violence. Those are the three major excuses, depending on what your agenda is, that we're seeing unfold in the Toronto Danforth shooting. So if we accept that mental illness is the culprit, what the Toronto Star wants us to believe, what the Toronto police right now want us to believe, is that that completely nullifies every other part of the discussion. Is that if we say Faisal Hussein had a mental illness, he definitely wasn't a terrorist, and it wasn't really a gun violence problem because, well, he was mentally ill. He would have gotten the gun whatever way he wanted. And if we accept that terrorism is the answer, you have to believe that the mental illness excuse is a hoax. He never had mental illness. He never had any psychological conditions. And if you believe it's gun violence, it's just, you respond with gun control, and that's that. So let's look at all the stakeholders in this discussion. John Tory and his cronies on Toronto City Council say it's gun violence. That's it. It's a gun violence problem and nothing else. You've got a lot of people that are taking a very hard line stance. This is terrorism. And then you've got people like the Toronto Star and Toronto Police, mental illness. I don't think mental illness and terrorism are mutually exclusive in this area. In fact, if we do accept, and this is, I would say, a very compassionate viewpoint, but if we are to accept that people with mental illnesses are sometimes susceptible to radical ideology, and I say sometimes because mental illness is a wide range and mostly non-violent. I mean, when I was mentally ill, I at best wanted to kill myself, no one else, and even then I failed at it. But the problem is when we start talking about mental illness as an explanation and as a catch-all to these sorts of things, what we're actually saying is that mental illness is inherently violent, which it isn't, whereas radical Islamic ideology is inherently violent. And that's the difference, is that not all mentally ill people want to kill others. Most don't. When you're talking about radical Muslims, and the radical ones, the Islamists, most of them do believe in violence. Most of them do believe in a violence that will overthrow the infidels and instill a caliphate. That's what they want. So we have to take them at their word when they say that. So I have no difficulty at all believing that radical Islamists are a little bit unhinged and are a little bit insane, but that doesn't matter. Because we still have to deal with the ideology itself. And if some mosque can preach, we must slay the infidels one by one, and then someone who's there who's not mentally ill will go, no, whatever, and someone who is will go, yes, and now I'm going to go out and do that, that still is a radical Islamic ideology problem. You can't separate the two. So when I'm looking right now at this discussion here, I believe that Faisal Hussein had mental health issues. We had a source tell Global News that he had been arrested twice at least under the Mental Health Act, which means that police were concerned either for his own well-being or for that of the people around him. When his parents put out a statement saying that he had had depression and psychosis, that statement, which Anthony Fury of the Toronto Sun, also a True North Initiative fellow, found out was actually done at the hands of a spin doctor, of a PR person. I believe it. I believe that there were mental conditions there, which means that it's all the more important for the people around someone in that situation to realize, okay, I think this person is probably at risk of violence. I think this person is probably at risk of doing something that is going to be a danger to themselves or to the people around them. This is not rocket science, but it becomes so difficult when stakeholders and institutions refuse to engage in these discussions. So what's the response when ISIS claims responsibility to this? You get the Toronto police saying, no, nothing to see here, nothing to see here. It's not there. Look away, folks. And then we had the other media report, CBS actually. CBS reported that he had been spoken to by authorities for what he was doing online. Now, I do think there is a concern here that a lot of this story has been driven by unnamed and anonymous sources. Or I said in a column I wrote, maybe just one really chatty anonymous source who's doing the rounds. But you always have to be very leery of who it is that's actually driving these discussions, who it is that's actually advancing an agenda. But I would stress that this is an issue that we're probably going to, even in 3 or 4 weeks, still have a great many unanswered questions. And this is one of the biggest problems with Canada's counterterrorism efforts, is that we tend to just move on very quickly. And I'll give you a great example of this. Look at even the Las Vegas shooting. Everyone, for days and days and weeks, was like, how did this guy learn to shoot? How did he get all these guns? How did he do this? What? And then everyone just moved on. Everyone just forgot about it. Now, I don't have a conspiracy theory about that Las Vegas shooting, nor do I have a conspiracy theory about this shooting. I want to see where the facts go. And I think that's what every law enforcement agency should want. I think it's what every media outlet should want. I think it's what every head of government should want. But if you look at the actual connections between all of these different incidents, even if people are dealing with mental illness issues, what is it that lets them, in their mind, justify violence? It's the ideology. And I'm not saying that's the case with Hussein, because we actually don't know. We don't know. And there are people that will draw a great many more conclusions from his name being Faisal Hussein than they would from his name being John Smith. But there's a reason for that, because we've seen far too many Faisal Hussein type names that have been involved in these types of things. And it's terrible. And if you are, like the vast majority of Muslims, completely uninterested in violence and in fact opposed to violence, I get why you are so distraught when you see an incident like this, when you see someone hijacking your faith and committing violence. And I'm sympathetic to that. But we also have to be very clear to not make every one of these acts of terror or potential acts of terror into a moral lecture about Islamophobia. Because that is the equivalent of saying all lives matter in response to whether someone says Black lives matter or someone else's lives matter. Like you're not actually dealing with the subject matter at hand. So we do know that Faisal Hussein's family was going to a mosque. We do know that he was, by all accounts, a practicing, or at the very least, believing Muslim. What we don't know is the extent to which that had a role in this particular shooting. And there are lots of people that are going to say, oh, well, of course it did. No, I'm not going to make assumptions. I'm going to see where the evidence goes. I'm not going to ignore what is painfully obvious, though. And that is that I cannot think of a single case where someone who did have a Muslim background committed a mass act of violence, and then we found out it had nothing to do with their religion. I honestly have not seen a single case where that has happened. I've had cases where people have been trying to make that claim, like Omar Mateen in, I think he was the Pulse nightclub shooter in San Bernardino, California, where people have said, oh, well, you know, it wasn't the religion, it was this. But that the person themselves, the actual killer, thought it was their religion. And I'm not going to tell a killer that, oh, they're wrong when they say they're doing it for whatever reason they say. So this is where I would take a long-term viewpoint of this, which is that we have to start having these discussions in a more frank and open way. But if you look at official Twitter right now, and if you're not familiar with it, official Twitter is a bunch of people with blue check marks. Now, I have a blue check mark. Not all people with blue check marks. but a bunch of people in Canada with blue check marks, they spend all day, every day retweeting each other, and they have this obsession with the right side in Canada. They have this obsession with conservatives, with people like Candace Malcolm and Anthony Furey and Ezra Levant and even me to some extent. And all of these people are consumed not by wanting to know the truth about what actually happened, but they're consumed by wanting to call out the response from people that are asking, hey, what happened? And this is just such a despicable display, and they're deliberately obfuscating. Like they're either incompetent or malicious, and I'll let you decide which one. But the problem is these people are too concerned with how conservatives respond to potential terrorism that they don't actually care about the incident themselves. They want to view every single one of these cases as an isolated incident. You know, I remember in math, I was never good at math, but I remember in math class in some grade, we had to put, you know, these little dots on a chart, and then eventually you had to find that, oh, well, you know, if you look at all the dots together, there's kind of a line that goes through the middle of them, and they called that, I think, the average or the mean. And they want to believe that there is no clustering. There's no grouping. There is no similarity whatsoever between this Faisal Hussein that shoots some people in Toronto and that Faisal Hussein that drives a van through a crowd and that Omar Mateen who shoots people and that Muhammad who stabbed. They want to believe that there's no connection between that. And trust me, I wish there was. I wish this wasn't an issue. I wish, and by the way, most Muslims wish, almost all Muslims wish this wasn't an issue. But we have to look at the ones who are causing the problems. And is it because they are unwell and this religion gives them justification, they feel? That's still a problem. That's still a problem. And I wonder where this is going to go when you have the media deliberately trying to say there's nothing to see here. And quite frankly, I mean, the mosque that the Hussein family went to was one I was familiar with because 7 years ago, back in 2011, it was the mosque that was at the center of the controversy called the Mosqueteria. And it was fascinating because this Mosqueteria was at Valley Park Middle School, which was just, I think, like a kilometer or two from where the Husseins lived. And every Friday, the school cafeteria would convert into a mosque. And you think, oh, well, you can't pray in school, but you can have a mosque in school. That seems a little weird. And the reason was they found that at this school, like half the students were getting up and leaving every Friday for a few hours to go to the mosque for prayer. So they figured, all right, let's just bring the mosque to the school. Not the solution, but whatever. And it was actually the mosque in Thorncliffe Park that the Husseins went to, Dar es Salaam, that organized this. And it was a very conservative and very strict mosque, and its practices were that boys had to go through one door in the cafeteria, girls had to go through another door, and that in and of itself you may find weird. It's common in Orthodox, some Orthodox synagogues for Jews. It was weird to have it in a school, but whatever. No, it was that there was a further subdivision where girls who were menstruating, these are middle schoolers. So, you know, all the grades 6, 7, 8 girls, you find out which ones of them are on their period, and they have to sit at the back of the room and they can't participate in prayers because they are unclean. And this was at a public school in Toronto. And I'm not rehashing that because it's still going on. No, I mean, you had all of these, you know, do-gooder Toronto liberal trustees that were like, oh, well, you know, we want to look tolerant and open and all of that stuff. But it was that this mosque was the one that drove that. This was the mosque that thought it was okay to, you know, haul the menstruating middle school girls to the back of the room and basically presume that this is a way that you can foster a good public school environment moving forward. And that was this mosque. So we know that it's a mosque that is probably on the wrong side of most Canadian issues, or what most Canadians would say are their positions, such as, for example, equality of women. Now, I see no evidence that is concrete that says the shooting in Toronto was gender-based. I know there was a news article that was circulating that said, you know, 8 of the 15 people he shot were women, but that also means 7 of the 15 weren't. So they were trying to make it seem as though there was a gender lens, and I'm not sure. There was a witness, though, that said it looked like he was targeting the women. So we don't know. People have already tried to make this about the toxic masculinity debate. There was another Toronto Star article about that. This was awful, 1,000-word article about basically trying to draw a line between this guy and that incel, that involuntary celibate thing that we started talking about after the Toronto van attack. And it was baffling because they said in like the second paragraph, we may never know the true extent of this. And then they spent the next 950 words saying, but I wonder if it's toxic masculinity. And it was great. I would love it if I could do that as a broadcaster. You know, I say at the beginning of something, I have no idea what it is. But for the next 3 hours, I'm going to talk about it as though it's this, Now, I'm talking about options right now. I'm not speculating. I'm actually talking about where the facts are taking us in this case. And the facts right now are the hardest to find if you look at mainstream media coverage. And it's not surprising, but it is quite disheartening that it's only through American media coverage that we're getting a lot of the information, and then Canadian media coverage picks it up along the way. And the ISIS claim was a great example of this. Reuters was the first one to say, hey, here's this announcement from ISIS that they're claiming responsibility. And even if ISIS did not orchestrate it, the fact that ISIS thinks, yeah, this is the type of thing that we can say falls within our mandate. The fact that ISIS was saying that in and of itself is newsworthy. But Canadian media were asleep at the switch on it. They either weren't paying attention, which I have a hard time believing because I've worked in Canadian newsrooms, or they didn't care because this didn't fit into the narrative that they were trying to craft in this story. And if you don't think there is a narrative at stake here, look at the words that have been used to describe Mohammed Hashim, the man that Anthony Fury in the Toronto Sun pegged as the architect of the Hussein family statement. And he in his own words had actually said that his goal is to craft a narrative that paints Muslims in a better light in Canada. That's his agenda. That's his goal. And look, if you're a Muslim in Canada, I don't blame you for wanting to do that, just as I want to, put conservatives in a good light. But it means that you have to view things that this man says and writes and is involved in with a grain of salt. And you need to view it through that lens of this is his end game. This is what it is that he's trying to do. So I'm looking at now the way forward for this case. And the fact that we will not be able to get to the bottom of anything if we don't break this pattern. If we don't break this pattern of actually trying to view things only through the lens of siloing. It was either just mental illness, it was either just gun violence, it was either just terrorism. I moved around the silos. I'm like playing that cup and ball game here live on the True North Initiative Facebook page. But I want to talk about the gun component because this is one of the more particularly insidious examples of this. There is a cultural battle about Islamic terrorism, and we know that culture war exists. When it comes to guns, it's less of a culture war and more of an actual lobbying effort. More of an actual lobbying effort that exists here, because there are a number of gun control groups that are just sitting at the sidelines waiting for anything they can use to justify pouncing. And we see these groups, the Canadian Coalition for Gun Control and all of these others, and they spared no time whatsoever in getting involved in this case. And John Tory, the Toronto mayor, went along with it. This guy's had an axe to pick because there are no guns in his house. He's had an axe to grind, rather, for guns for quite a while now. And when John Tory took less than 12 hours, the bodies weren't even cold yet, and he steps up and says, we have a gun problem in Toronto. Toronto has had 29 fatal homicides this year, 29 in basically 7 months that they've had. And if you look at those, the vast majority were gang-related, and as such, using illegal firearms. If you look at this case, the question that everyone was asking was, okay, how does a guy with mental illness get his hands on a firearm? And that was the question. It's a reasonable question. I put out a video explaining a little bit about the process, and I had people that clearly weren't watching the video that were responding and saying, well, duh, it was an illegal gun. Yeah, and I know that. And I knew that it was most likely going to be determined to be an illegal firearm. And that was why I put out the video that I did. Because I wanted people to understand how strict and rigorous the actual licensing procedures are to get a gun, especially if you've had a mental illness, because I wanted people to understand that there was only one way this was ever going to end, and that was with the determination that this was an illegal gun. And that's what the sources are all telling us now, an illegal firearm. And this is fascinating, because to get a gun in Canada, you need to get a license. You need to get what's called a possession and acquisition license, and that entitles you to go and get a rifle. Most rifles are a shotgun, and if you have a PAL, you walk into a store, you show your license, they write it down in a little book, they give you the gun, you take it, and you go home. It's easy. And ammunition's the same. You show your license, they write it down, you take your ammo, and you go home. If you want to buy a handgun or other select guns like an AR-15 or like some rifles that have been designated rather arbitrarily, but that's another discussion, by the government to be restricted, you need what's called an RPAL, a restricted possession and acquisition license. And the thing about an RPAL is that it's harder to get. There are 1 million in Canada, as opposed to, I think, 2 million PALs. So only half of the gun owners in Canada have restricted licenses. And in a lot of cases, when you get one of these, well, actually, in all cases, the government wants to know why you want a restricted license. They're going to ask why. And there are basically 2 correct answers to that question. One is for target shooting, and that's why I have my restricted, or the other is collecting. And if you are a collector, you can't really transport it, you can't go to the range, you can't do all of these other things with it very easily. And so if you want a restricted license, you have to give a reason. You have to go through a great many steps. So you have to take a firearm safety course for the restricted and the non-restricted. You have to go through a reference check and a background check. And in my case, and this is what I shared with you in my video this week, I actually do have a mental health history. I was survived a suicide attempt from 2010, and I had to disclose that. And they interviewed my family. They wanted to get a doctor's note. They wanted to make sure that no one in my immediate circle was against the idea of me having a gun, and no one was. So there was a pretty rigorous and stringent process there. And when I got my license, that put me in this category of Canadians who are subjected to daily background checks. This is what people don't know about gun owners. If you have a firearms license, you are actually screened every single day. More importantly, the police could knock on my front door right now, come in, and without a warrant, do an inspection to make sure my guns are stored properly. They haven't, but they could. And thankfully, if they did, they would find that they are. They're stored exactly the way they're supposed to be. But this is the way that the process in Canada works. And there are a number of areas where I think we could streamline the process and improve it. But generally speaking, our process is strict enough to weed out people with violent mental health issues, to weed out people with criminal past, even people with anger issues conceivably. So when we found out that Faisal Hussein's parents were saying, yes, he's had these mental health issues, medications haven't worked, psychiatric treatment hasn't worked, this to me told me there's no way he was actually a licensed gun owner, because his parents never would have given him the reference to get a license. And more importantly, if he had been arrested by police under the Mental Health Act, then his guns would be taken away, and that's that. So I laid out the facts for people, and the conclusion, and we've now heard this from a number of media reports, is that the gun was illegally owned. Now, how did he get it? We don't know. There was a story, I think it was in the Toronto Star, where like buried in one of the last paragraphs was what's called burying the lead, where like the most important part of the story is actually at the bottom of it. And what was interesting is that it was that he was living at a house in, I think it was Pickering or Scarborough or something, that his brother was living in, that had been raided and had 30 guns seized or something. So it sounds from that like there was a familial connection to the illegal gun trade, which again is a very, very relevant part of the story here, and one that's a lot more subdued if you look at the coverage about it. So the reason that I share all of this with you is that the access to the firearm had absolutely nothing to do with Canada's gun control regime. Absolutely nothing. But John Tory gets up there and says, we have a gun problem. Ask the question, why does anyone need to have a gun in this city? Very simple answer to that, John Tory. None of your damn business. None of your damn business. That's the answer. I don't need to justify any legal activity that I want to partake in. I don't need to justify why I need, 2 or 3 computers. I don't need to justify why I need a flat screen TV. I don't need to justify why I need to go on a vacation. If I want to, I can. That's the hallmark of a free society. More importantly, firearms ownership in Canada is not about need for a lot of people. For some it is. If you look at people in northern or remote communities, people that are hunters, it is in fact a need. But in a lot of people, it's sport shooting. Why do I need a bow and arrow? Why do I need to be a competitive archer? I'm not, but if I were. And that's the biggest problem here. But Toronto, even the so-called conservatives in Toronto, have this fear of guns, which is so drastically misunderstood. And I'll give you a great example of this. David Miller, who was the mayor of Toronto before Rob Ford, before John Tory, was quite baffled when he found out that there was a gun range in Union Station. So if you've ever been in Toronto to Union Station, you've walked through that main concourse. And if you are in that main concourse, trying to buy a train ticket, and you look up and it's that big, huge ceiling, up there somewhere was a gun range. And it was indoor. It was a handgun range formerly used, I think, by either CDSA or RCMP. And eventually it became a private gun club. It was the oldest gun club in Canada, or one of the oldest gun clubs in Canada. And guns had been going through the Union Station concourse for years, and no one was any the wiser. It was a smaller club, but people had, anytime they were shooting there, they had to have their handguns, in a little case. They were walking through, and there were handguns probably every day in Union Station, and no one, including David Miller, was any the wiser. David Miller found out about this, lost his mind, and quickly passed a bylaw, not just shutting it down, but making it so that no gun range could ever exist in the city of Toronto. And it was quite disheartening, because the rationale they used is, oh my goodness, someone could get shot. Well, no one had been. For 80 years, no one was getting hurt here. Why are you concerned now? And John Tory is doing something very similar. He sees something and decides that he's going to offer a solution for a problem that simply does not exist. A solution for a problem that's nowhere to be found. And that was Monday. Tuesday night, Toronto City Councillors get together, 41-4. 41-4, they pass a bylaw banning handgun sales and ammunition sales in Toronto. Except they can't actually do that. They can't actually ban anything of the sort. So what they're doing is passing a bylaw calling on the federal and provincial governments to ban it, calling on the federal government to ban gun sales, calling on the provincial government to ban ammunition sales, and to then make Toronto a handgun-free city. What I don't know if this would impact is private gun sales. For example, I want to sell my handgun to someone. I can do that. If they're licensed, I can call up the government and say, verify this license, initiate a transfer. I can sell them. If I lived in downtown Toronto, would I no longer be allowed to make a private sale to my gun-owning friend? I don't know, and I don't even think John Tory knows, because I don't think John Tory actually understands the laws that he's trying to add to. There's no way he does, because in his quote, and I wish I could play the clip for you right now, but we've posted it on the True North Initiative Facebook page. Don't watch it now, watch it later, because I'm still talking. But he said, oh, there's people carrying around guns. There's people carrying around guns. Well, if that was actually true, these people have already shown a blatant and brazen disregard for the law. If there are people walking around Toronto with firearms, they're proving that they're ignoring the law, because you cannot, there are very, very few exceptions. You cannot walk around with a handgun. So if you're walking around Toronto with a handgun, you are already in that category of being a non-law abiding gun owner. You are behaving illegally, and it stands to reason your gun is probably illegally owned, because those are the types of people that actually illegally buy guns, the ones that are using them illegally. So if Toronto manages to succeed in banning legal gun ownership, then all that will happen is the people like me who have guns legally will not be able to buy from a Toronto store. And here's the thing, my first handgun actually came from a Toronto store. My first handgun came from a Toronto store. They had a sale. It was a Ruger 2245, and it's a great gun. And the reason I find this so saddening is because now government is actually targeting a business that has done absolutely nothing wrong, a business that has ingrained itself in the gun community nationwide. And they're doing it all because of a knee-jerk reaction, or as one person said in the comment section, just a jerk reaction. I think either one's appropriate, but a knee-jerk or a jerk reaction to a tragedy. And what does Ralph Goodale, the federal public safety minister, say? That the federal government will entertain proposals to ban handguns. They say they'll entertain proposals. So the federal government actually might listen. The federal government might actually listen to these calls to do it. That doesn't mean they will, but they'll at least entertain the discussions. And that's really dangerous, because now we have the federal public safety minister making a proclamation in response to a knee-jerk reaction. It's a ripple effect here. And the end of this could be handguns being banned in Canada. That's essentially the direction that the gun control advocates are trying to go here. But when we have a gun that we have 99.9% certainty was illegally owned, how would any of these laws have prevented this? They wouldn't. A federal handgun ban would not have prevented Faisal Hussein from getting his gun. A provincial handgun ban would not have prevented it. A ban on the sale of handguns and ammunition in Toronto would not have made a difference. And there are two possibilities here. Either the lawmakers that are passing these restrictive gun bans don't know that these things wouldn't make a difference, or they don't care. And I think it's the latter. I think they know, but I think they don't care. I think they know that they're just creating the illusion of action, the illusion of doing things, the illusion of responding to a problem with a solution when they're doing no such thing. But the longer, and this is where it gets very important, and if you want to weigh in on this, have a chat in the comment section at the True North Initiative Facebook page here. The longer that politicians can keep the discussion about gun control, the less they have to talk about terrorism. So if everyone's looking over here at guns and gun control and handgun ammunition bans and handgun bans, then no one's looking over here at ISIS claiming responsibility. No one's looking at the mosque that's preaching radicalism potentially. No one's looking at any of these other factors that could have and very likely did have a stake in this. And when we see terrorists and terrorist incidents that involve knives and that involve vans and that involve homemade explosives and that involve any of these other things, the gun is irrelevant to a terrorist. The gun is irrelevant. They're going to use whatever tool is at their disposal. In this case, if it was in fact terrorism, it was a gun. Whatever it was, the guy wanted to kill. He used a gun. He used what was available to him, as it is to anyone else who wants to break the law. If he didn't have the gun, does anyone think, oh, well, I guess no, it's not my thing? No. Then it would have been a van attack. It would have been a knife attack. It would have been any number of these things, because the problem is not the tool. And I can't stress this enough. The problem is the people. The problem is the group of people that wants to actually commit violence. We can't ban the tool and expect that this motivation in these people's distorted and deranged minds is going to go away. It's not the case. So these knee-jerk reactions to ban things are irrelevant. And I made a comment, this was a couple of years ago on a radio show I was doing, and it was taken so wildly out of context during the last election. I had said, you know, this is no more sensible to ban guns because one person committed a violent gun crime than it would be to ban bungee jumping because of an accident that happened there, or ban cars because of a car accident, or ban Islam because of an Islamic terrorism attack. And that was then misquoted as Andrew Lawton said, let's ban Islam, that'll save a few lives. What I was doing was mocking the idea that we should ban anything because of how an evil person chooses to take advantage of it. And that's true with guns, that's true with van rentals, that's true with any of these other things that we're talking about here. So when I look at the direction that we're likely to go forward with this case, we have to start with a return to sensible policy making by the government on counter-radicalism, on actually identifying terrorism. But we need more culturally in law enforcement and in politics and in the media a sense of willingness to talk about and discuss these issues. Because if we don't talk about these issues, we are signing our own death warrants. If every time a case like this comes up, we try to find every possible reason other than the one that's staring us directly in the face to rationalize or explain, who are we helping? Who are we helping? Are we protecting the feelings of the Muslim community? No, because the moderate Muslim community is our greatest ally in this. They want to purge the radicalism from within their own midst as well. And the ones that condemn radicalism, we must support. The ones that don't condemn radicalism, we must expose. But you can't do that if you don't actually have the discussions. And you look at people like Tariq Fatah and Raheel Raza and Salim Mansour, incredibly brilliant people that have been sounding the alarm about these issues for years, and about the lack of a willingness within the media to engage on these files. And people on the left have been splitting hairs, I've found, over the idea of whether ISIS claiming responsibility means that it's an ISIS attack. And I wanted to address that for a few moments here, because ISIS is not like Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, which had a centralized operation, they had a little control room, and they were organizing and funding and doing all of this. ISIS is as much an institutional force as it is a set of ideas and a set of values. I mean, ISIS is a religion in and of itself, you could argue. And when ISIS has its formal operations, ISIS also has its people that it's calling to violence through propaganda. People that it's saying, we are motivating you and urging you and telling you how to do this, and then you're going to do it on your own. So even if this guy had never talked to an ISIS organizer, that doesn't mean it's not an ISIS attack. Because the problem is the ideology more than, or at least as much as, the infrastructure itself. And that's where I think a lot of actually pretty much all of the liberal media in Canada are missing the mark, is that ISIS is about the ideas and the ideology that's driving people to commit these attacks. And this is where, to go back to the discussion about mental illness, we need to understand that if someone is dealing with depression or psychosis and their outlet for that is radical Islam, that doesn't mean it's not a radical Islam discussion. It's a mental illness discussion and a radical Islam discussion. If someone who is mentally ill has the risk factors of an ISIS extremist or an ISIS motivated extremist, then we need to deal with both issues. We have in Ontario, across Canada, but in Ontario specifically where this happened, we have an infrastructure where police can arrest anyone who is at a risk of harming themselves or others. And this is probably where police had arrested Faisal Hussein in the past for under the Mental Health Act. We don't know whether it was for wanting to harm himself or wanting to harm others, but we do know that they had arrested him under that provision in the past. So someone at some point was concerned that this guy was someone who needed to be taken off the streets, at least for a time. And then we had another report that said he had at one point told someone that he wanted to kill. These are not risk factors that can be ignored. These are not risk factors that we can just shrug our shoulders and say, he's probably just mouthing off, he's probably just letting off steam. These are things that are important. So once again, we have a case where the lone wolf was actually the known wolf. And by the way, we don't even see the use of the term lone wolf anymore. I have not seen in any reasonable media coverage this called a lone wolf attack, because lone wolf people associate with terrorism. People associate the term lone wolf with terrorism. So to even use the term lone wolf, which used to be kind of the way that people would try to dilute the impact of terrorism, we now don't even say it. We just say shooter or killer. And it's valid, it's completely accurate to say that he was a shooter or a killer and a human scumbag and walking fecal matter, whatever you want to call him. But he was actually a killer. And when you start seeing the obliteration of words like lone wolf, it's because they're further trying to dilute that there could be terror motivations and terror influences on crimes like this. So the next question, and it's a logical question, is, does it matter? Does it matter if this is terrorism? It does. It does. People have argued, and you see on the Twitter sphere this discussion, that, well, it doesn't really matter what the reason was. It matters if we want to talk about prevention. If we want to talk about prevention, it matters. If it's mental illness exclusively, well, that means mental illness is something that we need to take seriously in society, which I think we do. If it's terrorism exclusively, then countering extremism is something we need to do and have a much better track record of doing. If it is in that mushy middle there, mental illness and terrorism, which I suspect it is, and I would contend very fervently that it probably is, then we still need to deal with both issues. But you have those with an agenda that are trying to push this into someone else's space. So you have those with the agenda that radical Islamic extremism doesn't exist, that are trying to push this to mental illness, and you have those who are on the gun side of things saying, it's not a gun control issue. No. It's not a gun control issue, by the way, because the tool is always secondary to the motivation. So if you want to tackle this, the motivation is where you actually have to identify the problem. So what are we likely to see unfold from this moving forward? I don't love making predictions because there's a human factor, and at some point when confronted with more information, people will have to stop viewing this only through their own agenda. But I also think that on this particular case, we're seeing a lot more deliberate obfuscation by the people who are supposedly leading the ideas game on this. We had Gerald Butts, the principal secretary to Trudeau, retweeting a few days ago a tweet that called the National Post a hate publication or something. I mean the left is trying to cleanse the country of any even marginally critical coverage. I mean, when the National Post, you may not like every column in the National Post, but to call it a hate site, to put it right up there with, I don't know, Stormfront or whatever, it is just so disgusting. And for the guy who is the right-hand man of the Prime Minister to say that is absolutely disgusting. And then you have the Canadian Twitterati going around and mocking the coverage of Anthony Furey and Candace Malcolm and the True North Initiative and other groups as well. And it's shameful. And I hope it's transparent. I hope people are actually seeing through this and identifying it for what it is. But it's not going to be easy. We need to break through that, which is why it is so important to share. It is so important to become a club member over at the True North Initiative. It's important to actually combat and push back against that narrative. And just another example of this, if I may, and this is some very good news. We know that Caitlin Coleman, who is the wife of Joshua Boyle, is now back in the United States. She is an American. I think she's from Pennsylvania. She has, as of yesterday or 2 days ago, returned to the United States. She is living with her parents and her 3 kids, and she's pregnant with a 4th child, presumably Joshua Boyle's. Caitlin Coleman was the one who I really thought was the victim of the kidnapping and abduction of Joshua Boyle and Caitlin Coleman. They had 3 kids in captivity in Afghanistan and then later in Pakistan, and no one had ever answered the question of whether why they had gone there. I mean, Joshua Boyle gave some very creepy interviews, and this is the guy who was married to Zainab Khater, the jihadi sister of Omar Khater. And Joshua Boyle had gone to Afghanistan backpacking with his pregnant wife, as we all do. I mean, I can't even take my wife to Walmart if she doesn't want to go there, but he can manage to bring his pregnant wife to the foothills of Afghanistan, and then they get kidnapped, it's said, and were held by the Haqqani network. And Joshua Boyle wouldn't say whether he was a Muslim, but their kids all had Arabic Muslim names. Caitlin Coleman was wearing a full hijab and a very tight hijab, and did an interview in which she wouldn't say whether she was a Muslim or not. And then Joshua Boyle was charged with sexual assault and administering a noxious substance. And the details of this are under a publication ban, so media cannot report who the victim of this was. But regardless of that, we know that Caitlin Coleman later left Joshua Boyle. And now she's gone back to the US. And there was a photo of her with her family, no hijab. She looked happier than she had in any other coverage or photos I had seen. She was visibly pregnant, and she was with her parents, and she was smiling, and it was actually great. And I really, really hope that she does well. I don't know anything about her. I know that she's always been a bit of a nerdier woman. She, met Joshua Boyle. They fell in love. They went on, a true love story to the foothills of a terrorist-controlled region in Afghanistan, and now she's back home. And this story was, again, one where the media was trying to paint Joshua Boyle as a victim when he was anything but. And at the very least, he was questionable. At the very worst, he was. And then when he got charged, there was more speculation to say that he was a perpetrator, at least of some wrongdoing, allegedly. And what was fascinating is that the media was still giving this guy the glamour treatment. And it's the same as with Faisal Hussein now, where he is given this treatment as being the victim of this. When of all the people you could point to who are actually victims, he is not one I would put anywhere but at the very bottom of the list. He is not the victim. Joshua Boyle was not the victim. Now, there's a case to be made that Faisal Hussein's family are being victimized by this. His parents are being victimized. I don't know anything about them. They haven't done any interviews, nor will they. They haven't even been named. This is interesting. They put out a statement, and the media will not report their names. The media knows their names, but the media will not report the names of their family. And even knowing the mosque that they went to, the reason that we know was not because journalists did the actual digging. It was because the imam of the mosque decided he would do a sit-down interview with CBC because he wanted to talk about how his concern was, in his words, backlash. This is what he said. The imam of the Dar es Salaam said, yes, mental illness and care is important, mental health care is important, but he said his first concern was backlash. When you are more concerned about the impact of a tragedy on you than you are about the actual victims of it, there is a serious priority question that Canadians need to ask and the Canadian media needs to ask, and that is not happening. We're going to have lots more on this throughout the day and the week. If you want to weigh in on this in the comment section, please do. If you want to email me, my email address is andrew@andrewlawton.ca. For the True North Initiative, I'm Andrew Lawton. Have a great rest of the week.